All right, off we go. Thanks everybody for your time, and thank you, Oz, for for setting this up and for having me at this virtual meetup. And again, great talk by the folks that just went up in front. To situate the context, I did get a chance to look at some of the prior talks that this meetup has had. I think there's been a periodic, somebody that comes along talks about phishing, and somebody that also talks about NLP, and has already talked about NLP. So I figured that what might be a little bit more interesting is to sort of have situate a conversation that I've been having with a lot of the the CISOs and people that are in the InfoSec community that are thinking about, hey, as I think about my career progression and as I think about securing my own organization, how should I sort of situate this context? How do I achieve in my organization a very effective cybersecurity strategy? And so what I'd like to talk about in this in this conversation here, and I'd love for people to chime in as well, and is to basically break down how how most CISOs are thinking about this, and what we think our perspective is in terms of achieving some of the basic hygiene when it comes to cybersecurity. What is the vendor a lot of the vendor conversations that typically come into a context like this, and how do you think about these? So I'll briefly start with that, and of course towards the end I'd like to plug a little bit about what we do at ArmorBlocks. So stay tuned for that, and also show you a quick demo of what our product does. With that, a little bit about myself. I'm Dhananjay Sampath, co-founder and CEO of ArmorBlocks. In terms of the background, very briefly, I got a PhD in computer engineering. My dissertation was thankfully backed by DARPA and DoD, so I got an opportunity to do some pretty cool, interesting stuff while working for the military. Right after I graduated, I got an opportunity to work at Juniper Networks, in mostly in security-related stuff. I was building out unified threat management products for Juniper before joining Talkin for a short stint as a research scientist, and before navigating into the startup land, where I was the VP of engineering of a container security startup, and eventually, deciding to start something in a more interesting space than container security. Container security, don't get me wrong, was very exciting, but after having a conversation with Hillary Clinton's campaign managers, Rodney Mook and John Podesta, learned that email security was still broken, and caused an entire election to go sideways because of basic hygiene being missed. And that got me and my co-founders pretty excited about, hey, wait a minute, we could solve this problem using natural language understanding and basic data science hygiene, and being able to look at what emails, what it means to protect your emails. So I ended up putting ArmorBlocks together, which is where I'm the CEO at this point. Now, just a very brief context setting. One of the things that I've learned, talking to a lot of the security organizations as a CEO of a company, is whenever a vendor shows up, there are very classic ways by which the vendors engage with the community, and so I'll start with that, situate the context, talk about what myth versus what sort of reality, and then start talking about how a security program is being constructed in most organizations like that of yours, especially what are the things that CISOs inside of organizations, chief information security officers or chief risk officers, or the head of InfoSec, how are they thinking about it as they start constructing about, constructing their security programs inside of these organizations. So most vendors that are going to show up, they're going to talk about how the sky is falling, how the entire world is, sort of doomed. This is a classic graph that you will see pretty much everywhere. There are, it's attacks everywhere. We have a graph like this. Don't get me wrong, I'm not dissing on vendors, but at the same time, it is one of those things that you normally see. It starts out with, something really bad happened here, and things continue to keep happening bad, and, it turns worse, and finally it goes up to a point where it's just incredibly high. But the perspective to sort of look at this with when you're evaluating, a vendor coming in is to recognize that it's not all doom and gloom, when you go from the left to right. One of the reasons why you're seeing, the attacks sort of increase is because everything today is online, everything's connected, and everything's open to potential security attacks, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, your attack surfaces, when you think about, hey, what are my attack surfaces? What are the threat models that I need to sort of make sure that I'm adopting? All of those are constantly evolving and changing, and you are seeing a larger surface as you think about how to construct a program that protects it. So it's not very surprising that these are going up, from left to right, and vendors don't necessarily help in the situation, right? They show up, and you've got skulls and crossbones everywhere, and media makes it worse. They come back with every single a CVE now has a logo and a brand name. It's either Heartbleed or it's got to have like a theme music too. So yes, it gets worse because people are trying to grab your attention as quickly as possible. And everybody's responsible. I'm not just blaming one sort of folks or the other, but the idea is to grab your attention by instilling some amount of fear. Hey, all your data is going to, you've lost. You are at risk today, and conversations like that constantly are reinforced in the press and media. When you are looking, when you are sitting down, because almost every single person inside of in this meetup at this point in time, are going to find yourself in this position where you're going to say, okay, here's a vendor. Either hey, my CISO just asked me to look at this thing, or you have been assigned a specific program where you have to sit down and evaluate solutions that are out there and decide if this is a good fit for your situation or not. And so when you sit down to do that, one of my goals over here is to be able to provide some sobering frameworks to think about, hey, what is reality with this? What is a myth, and how do I sort of think about this when I sit down and evaluate a vendor? And so my ask over here is to sort of have some amount of empathy, because you do want to be able to listen to what somebody has to say, and sort of learn from that process, but at the same time, sort of making sure that you understand what your position looks like. So one of the first things is, there's this, situation where you've got to understand that there's some amount of risks involved in having an organization with so many people doing different things and trying to move incredibly fast to be able to support your organization. And so you've got to sort of get, sort of understand that there's a very high likelihood of your organization being breached, and the likelihood that it will be breached again in the future. Now, what is sort of what you don't have to come to terms with is that assume that this is, you should just accept that the security breaches is the de facto standard and position that you have to be, and financial loss is okay. I'll tell you why this is a myth, and I want to basically situate this context with respect to email security, which is sort of what we do at ArmorbLocks. Increasingly, when we go to organizations, we recognize that people have sort of given up on emails. One of the things we learned was that emails are a true system of record, and it still is, and I'm sure you'll recognize it yourself. In an organization, if you do anything inside the organization, whether you're purchasing something, you're purchasing your AWS, credits, or your GCP credits, or you're purchasing, a vulnerability scanner, you're going through your SOC 2 auditors, every single thing requires communication outside of your organization, and almost always that happens over emails, right? And when we went inside of organizations and said, okay, hey, you might have an email security problem, and we started analyzing it, most organizations, we discovered that they'd lost, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, and they were not ready to sort of come to terms with the fact that that is the norm. I would rather just purchase a cybersecurity insurance policy and basically bury my head under the sand, sort of what I'd like to call the ostrich algorithm, and pretend that this is not a problem. You don't have to do that. You don't have to accept the myth that you should just accept the security breaches. There are things that you can't do about it. So those are sort of like a yin and yang of how you sort of think about this problem, on a larger scale. The next common theme that we observed talking to a lot of these security organizations is the fact that the reality was that, hey, security products are are useful in a very specific context, right? Security products are extremely good at blocking something that's already known, and you understand how to sort of mitigate the risk with respect to those known vectors. Now, most vendors come into these conversations wanting to be the be-all and end-all. They want to be able to offer you a single pane of glass where they say, hey, we've got this one thing that can block all types of attacks, predict everything that's going to happen and before it happens, and make sure that your organization is completely foolproof and locked down when it comes to risk. And that is a myth. Anytime a vendor says that I've got everything that you need, that's when you sort of go back and say, that sounds more like a stake-all situation. It's important to recognize that the product that you're purchasing, solve very specific problems, and it's important for you to know that, hey, there are no silver bullets, and so being able to tell the difference is very crucial when you sit down to evaluate your security posture. The next key thing that I like to talk about is sort of the how do you sort of think about what's next, right, in terms of the situation. Classic myths in this situation is, hey, I have the next-gen solution that will solve all your security needs and your security problems. And anytime you see a next-gen solution, you're going to notice that is not really an ideal situation. I mean, you want to understand what are the, what is sort of your security posture, how is it evolving, and how you evolve by incorporating the appropriate new signals. So you'll notice that, when constantly attackers are going to come up, with mechanisms that leapfrog, your existing security controls. You might have set something up in place, but somebody's going to come up with a way of, figuring out how to overcome that, those security controls, and finding their way around it. And so it's important, for the organizations to sort of understand that you have to evolve. And you have to evolve by incorporating, constantly new signals. And so that's sort of a key aspect of, staying current, when you're evaluating vendors. Now, the approach that most folks recommend is to sort of ensure that when you think about the cybersecurity posture for your organization, it's incredibly simple to sort of, keep things very focused. You want to have the ability to chew on, have chewable chunks where you're just eating one bite at a time. So make it very simple. Keep things small, keep things, very specific, and then make sure that you're moving forward all the time. So that's sort of how, most successful organizations have a program that evolves and it constantly moves forward, and it's very successful, as you scale the entire organization. So what are those first few bites, and how would you think about that? The very first key item over here is to be able to start with what you have, right? And here's where it becomes incredibly important to take stock of the situation. Take a look at what exactly do you have today in your organization. Conduct a very basic audit. Find out what's working, what could be better, and sort of situate, get a quick 360 view of what's happening inside of your existing security processes. And it's not important to have a complete overhaul of your system. It's incredibly important to sort of recognize that you don't have to change every aspect of your existing security investments. You want to be able to identify what's important and what's not, and that sort of leads naturally into the second bite, if you will, which is to evaluate your gaps and risks. And so when you sit across a vendor showing up and saying, hey, here's a new technique that we have, or here's a solution that we have, I think a key thing to think about is, what are the true sources of risk to your organization? It's entirely possible that what you're listening to or what you're hearing about is very cool from a technology perspective, but it needs to matter to you. You have to understand, have you evaluated what's missing inside of the organizations? It's here where when we go to a lot of the companies, we recognize that people have not thought about email security as a gap that exists, right? They still think of it as a checkbox item that sort of already is set up and it's protecting them sufficiently. But when you sort of evaluate what has happened in the past, 30, 60, 90 days, you recognize that there have been a vast number of attacks that have come in via a simple email credential phishing attack or a business email compromise, and might have even resulted in losses that cross millions of dollars. So it's important to sort of prioritize appropriately. Once you evaluate your gaps and risks, I love to sort of use this this verbiage where it says follow the money. What are the investments that you have put in? What are where do you see gaps? Where do you see that money sort of leaving your organization from a security posture perspective? And that should instantly snap your put your or sequence your priorities rather quickly. Which obviously brings me to the next step, which is how do you prioritize? If you have evaluated your gaps and you have associated them with appropriate dollar amounts and budgets, you can now start thinking about, okay, what is my biggest priority? What is the biggest burning concern that I need to look for, and how do I solve for that? So when you start thinking about it this way, now you basically go back to saying, okay, let me take a step back. Let me take a step back and look at what do I have in my stack today? How am I, and once you evaluate that and once you understand your gaps, you say, okay, this is my top priority. My C-suite is getting hammered constantly by specific targeted attacks. My entire company is, receiving impersonation attempts, impersonation emails. My HR is actually responding to W-2 requests from outside of the company, and it's sending PII, or PCI information right outside the door, over emails. I might have invested heavily in data protection strategies, but if somebody's just emailing things outside the door, there's, you need to have something that's capable of, being able to stop that. So your prioritization piece now comes into effect, where you're trying to pick the right sets of items to protect your organization. It's shocking sometimes when you look at, campaigns, when you talk to, people, the IT staff that run some of these campaigns, national and local campaigns, having a simple MFA hygiene, trying to set up two-factor or multi-factor authentication for your email account is still not something that's a very common, very prevalent situation. So something as simple as that now becomes your top priority, as opposed to something that's more something that might be potentially cool or an awesome, interesting project. Basic hygiene becomes your top priority. And it's rather ironic I'm talking about basic hygiene in this time and date, but a very similar analogy applies to cybersecurity as well. Last but not least, it's very important to partner up, and this is a little bit self-serving, and I say that because at the end of the day, to be able to do effective, implement effective controls inside of your organization, you are going to need to have appropriate, support from people inside of your company. You're going to require developers to not check in credentials inside of GitHub. You're going to require people to make sure that they are doing the right thing when it comes to, reporting phishing attacks. And it's important to talk to the right set of vendors to be able to engage with you as a partner in being able to implement appropriate controls inside of your organization. It's important to sort of be humble, in these situations where you want to be able to partner up effectively and address the gaps that you might have working with experts that can help, address that. And also, important to sort of keep community always on top of mind, whether it's an open source community or, it's more of a community inside of your own company or a vendor ecosystem. So, this is sort of a quick overview of how, I'd love for people to sort of think about evaluating and working, with the vendors. Also thinking about how to sort of normalize the processes that you might have inside of your evaluate, appropriate technologies. With that said, one of the quick things I like to be able to switch gears over here before I open this up for questions, is a little bit of a self-serving plug in sort of describing what ArmorBlocks does. ArmorBlocks is a cloud-native email security platform. We're in the business of protecting organizations against targeted inbound attacks and also to prevent outbound data loss. Everybody here, perhaps already knows this, but if you don't, in the past, 4 years or 3 years actually, there's been $26 billion that has been lost due to business email compromise. If you've not heard the word BEC or business email compromise, it's an email that shows up that does not contain a phishing link, does not contain a malicious attachment. It's a simple email that says, hey, you got to pay this invoice. You owe us X amount of dollars, and it'll go into collections if you don't pay quickly. And you'd be shocked and surprised at how many people actually respond to that email and actually even pay whatever invoice dollar amounts needs to be paid out. These BEC attacks are crafted incredibly well. The attackers do a lot of research. They prepare these emails and they execute them in a very targeted fashion. And once they see this working, they repeat that same pattern in a much broader scale, and they disseminate this across the board. And we at ArmorBlocks, what we do is we're trying to make it incredibly easy to help defend your organizations. The way we do this is by leveraging a broad spectrum of signals that are out there, and we look at, hey, your communication patterns, who the users are, basically understanding the identities of users, identifying who they are inside of the organizations, what their hierarchy and the scope of work is, what sort of roles they play inside of the organization. And then we look at what the users do, what their sending patterns are, what the login locations are, and how often do they communicate with users inside and outside of the organization, and sort of modeling the behavior of the user themselves. And last but not least, we look at how the users communicate back and forth, with people inside the organizations and outside as well. And we do this using language models to be able to, which are basically grounded in NLP, natural language processing. And we're looking at the intent and tone of how people communicate, right? What are they communicating? What are the topics that they're talking about? What are their writing styles? How often do they, address people differently, and so on and so forth. And so the combination of all of these signals, we've got, north of over, several hundred signals that are combined to be able to effectively detect something that, perhaps looks suspicious. To give you a quick preview of what this looks like, let me just hop into this, the demo of this. So it takes roughly about a couple of minutes for you to be able to plug this into your system. And then what ArmorBlocks does is it starts providing basic hygiene. So that what we were talking about before, the context was to solve for some of the basic gaps. If email security and compliance with respect to emails is top of mind, we try to make it incredibly simple because we certainly believe that your email, while being the true system of record, is the least introspected data source inside of your organization. So we try to make that incredibly easy for your security analysts. So here is an example of a payroll fraud. There's a person that's writing to your HR saying, hey, I recently changed my bank account. Can you please update my direct deposit information, and can this be effective? Can this change be effective as soon as possible? The key things are to be able to, from an identity perspective, we look at, hey, does this person usually send emails from this email address? And turns out, that's not really true. While Rupert Eddings does work inside of this company, this person does not normally send emails from his gmail.com based on past history. As you can see, that the communication history over here is pretty low. So based on this, we're able to identify that this person is not, the person who he or she claims to be. And then we move into the behavioral aspects of this person. We say, hey, does Rupert normally, write from this specific client? And if he does not, we flag that. And then we also notice that in addition to this, on the language basis, this person is asking about a financial transaction. This person is, causing, an HR person to respond rather quickly by communicating with a sense of urgency. And on top of it, it's asking, asking about, talking about bank information and so on and so forth. So things related to, confidential pieces of data. So, we're able to successfully sort of look at all of these aspects, when it comes to emails, and then we go above and beyond that. We auto remediate all of these, make it easy for somebody to be able to go across multiple mailboxes. Take auto remediation steps where we automatically delete them or quarantine those emails appropriately across multiple mailboxes. And last but not the least, we also make it incredibly easy to protect your organization from a compliance perspective to not share confidential data outside using emails. So that's a little bit about ArmorBlocks and what we do. And again, I think we're approaching 8 o'clock, so I'll pause here really quickly and take any questions. But one last point I would like to leave you with as we wrap up here is to, again, when you think about how you are structuring your cybersecurity programs inside of your organization, if you structure it in such a way that you're thinking about the basic hygiene steps that you have to take, you sort of prioritize, the gaps that you are seeing inside of your organization, and last but not the least, if you partner up with the appropriate vendors, you're highly likely to be successful inside of your organization. And hopefully you consider, vendors like ArmorBlocks, as you think about, hey, who's the vendor that's trying to scare you into buying something versus, who's trying to basically help you and make your life a lot easier. That's pretty much it from me. Over to you all. Any questions that you have, more than happy to answer that.
I have a question. So during this, basically during the filtering, you're also looking at the body of the email, not just the sender and everything. Will that lead to any privacy issues?
That's a great question. So if privacy is sort of a very interesting perspective, right? Like a lot of the email providers already at this point in time, your emails are in the cloud. When you see any sort of those automatic responses at the bottom of your emails, there are machines that are already reading your emails to be able to construct a response, an automated response to your emails. So, from that perspective, we're not doing anything that's different from what a machine would already do or your service provider already does. The key is in terms of building appropriate controls. We ensure that no humans are sitting and evaluating all of your emails. If there is an incident that is actually flagged, like you are seeing over here, if you wanted to access this part of it, there's an RBAC control, role-based access control. And that you can set up where you can say, hey, the analyst cannot see the contents of the email, but the admin can. And this way, things that are flagged as an incident, suspicious incident, it just makes it incredibly easy for the security analyst to review that. Now, one last legal piece that we come across this when we go in organizations is that the expectation of privacy is very different when you're using your work emails as opposed to your personal emails. This is in the context of your mostly, with respect to your work emails, and so the when you click into one of these and you open them up and you read those emails, the emails have been flagged as being something something that's actually suspicious, and on top of that, we're just making it easy for your security analysts to be able to get to that email.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think we don't have any questions. Thank you, DJ, for your talk.
Thanks, Oz, for hosting it. It's been a wonderful event. Thank you.